What most people never understand about avoidance is that the relationship dynamic was never built entirely on love. It was built on emotional positioning. And that positioning only works as long as one person keeps chasing clarity, reassurance, connection, or validation. The avoidant doesn't always consciously plan this. In many cases, it's a survival strategy formed years before they ever met you. But the effect is still the same. One person becomes emotionally responsible for keeping the connection alive while the other controls distance. That's why the moment you stopped chasing changed everything. You have to understand how powerful that shift really is. Because when you were constantly reaching out, trying to fix misunderstandings, trying to explain your heart, trying to prove your loyalty, you were unknowingly stabilizing the entire emotional structure. Your effort allowed them to remain emotionally passive. Your anxiety became the glue holding the connection together. And avoidants become very comfortable inside that arrangement. Not because they're evil, not because they enjoy hurting people, but because pursuit gives them psychological safety. If you are always the one, three are moving toward them, they never have to fully confront vulnerability themselves. They can stay in control of proximity. They can decide when intimacy increases and when it disappears. They can retreat emotionally and still trust that you'll reopen the door. But something changes when a person reaches emotional exhaustion. There comes a moment where the empath, the overgiver, the deeply patient person suddenly realizes, I cannot keep sacrificing my peace just to maintain someone else's comfort. And when that realization becomes real, not performative, not manipulative, but real, the energy shifts immediately. You stop sending the extra paragraph. You stop forcing conversations. You stop monitoring their moods. You stop trying to decode silence. And most importantly, you stop making their emotional unavailability the center of your inner world. That's the moment the power dynamic changes. Because now the avoidant is standing in a reality they were never prepared for. Access is no longer guaranteed. And psychologically, that hits harder than people realize. Human beings often fail to appreciate emotional stability while it's constantly available. Familiarity creates blindness. 3, avoidant unconsciously adapted to your presence as something permanent. They assumed that no matter how distant they became, no matter how inconsistent the behavior was, you would remain emotionally invested. Your care became predictable, and predictable things are often undervalued. But when your energy genuinely leaves, the nervous system notices immediately. Now they check the phone and feel the absence. Now they sense the silence differently. Now they realize the emotional safety net is gone. And here's the deeper truth. Your silence forces them into contact with themselves. As long as you were chasing them, their attention stayed focused on managing you, your emotions, your reactions, your pursuit. But once you emotionally detach, they lose the distraction. Suddenly, they are alone with the unresolved emotions they spent years avoiding. That is why your withdrawal feels so powerful. Not because silence is a game, but because absence removes illusion. For the first time, they experience what the relationship actually feels like without your constant emotional labor carrying it forward. And many avoidants are deeply unsettled by that realization because they begin to understand the READ, something they never fully acknowledged before. You were bringing warmth, stability, patience, and emotional depth into a connection they often took for granted. Now, this doesn't mean every avoidant suddenly transforms overnight. Some will double down on detachment. Some will distract themselves. Some will try to regain control through mixed signals or sudden attention. But internally, the dynamic has changed forever because they felt the shift in your energy. And energy never lies. When someone no longer fears losing you, they chase control. But when they feel you truly release them emotionally, they confront loss. And those are two completely different experiences. The day you stopped chasing was the day the illusion of control began to collapse. What most people misunderstand about emotional dynamics with avoidance is that they assume intensity is what creates impact. They believe anger, arguments, confrontation, or emotional breakdowns are what wakes someone up. But with avoidance, it rarely works that way. In fact, intensity often confirms their internal strategy. To retreat, to disconnect, to regain control by stepping away from emotional pressure. So here's the paradox. The very thing you think will bring them closer actually gives them permission to leave. Avoidants are not primarily regulated by emotional force. They are regulated by emotional distance. Their nervous system is wired in a way that associates closeness with pressure and pressure with threat. So when things become emotionally charged, their instinct is not to engage deeper, it is to reduce exposure. They don't process conflict the way more secure individuals do. They process it as something to escape rather than something to resolve. But when you withdraw calmly, without chaos, without reaction, without emotional escalation, something very different happens. You become unreadable. And that is what unsettles them the most. Because emotional distance without conflict removes their usual defense system. If you are angry, they can label you as too emotional. If you are pleading, they can categorize you as needy. If you are arguing, they can justify their withdrawal. But when you are calm, grounded, and simply no longer emotionally available in the same way, they lose the psychological script that allowed them to stay detached. This is where your silence becomes powerful. Not because 3A use silence as a tactic, but because silence removes friction. When you stop reacting, they no longer receive emotional feedback loops that confirm their behavior. There is no more emotional chase to manage, no more reassurance requests to deflect, no more cycles of push and pull they can predict and control. Instead, they are faced with stillness, and stillness creates awareness. At first, avoidants often interpret this as relief. They tell themselves, finally, things are calm. But over time, that calm starts to feel different. It stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like absence. Because emotional systems are not just built on intensity, they are built on connection. And when connection disappears without drama, the mind is forced to interpret what's actually happening. This is where emotional withdrawal becomes more impactful than emotional conflict. Conflict keeps the attachment alive. Withdrawal questions it. When you are emotionally reactive, the avoidant still has influence over your state. They can push, pull, engage, or disengage and still see visible reactions. But when you stop reacting, you remove that influence. They are no longer able to measure your emotion, availability in real time. And that creates discomfort because it disrupts their sense of relational control. Now they are dealing with uncertainty. And uncertainty is something the avoidant mind struggles with deeply, even if it appears calm on the surface. Because beneath the detachment, there is still a need for predictability, a need to know where they stand without having to fully enter emotional vulnerability. So when your emotional presence becomes neutral instead of reactive, something shifts internally for them. They start scanning for meaning. They start reinterpreting past interactions. They begin to question whether your silence is temporary or final. And most importantly, they begin to realize that they can no longer rely on your emotional availability as a constant. That realization creates cognitive dissonance. Because part of them expected you to stay emotionally engaged no matter what they did. That expectation wasn't always conscious, but it was embedded in the pattern. Your emotional investment created predictability. And now that predictability is gone, this is why emotional neutrality is so powerful. It doesn't attack them. It doesn't accuse them. It simply, Threya removes the emotional structure they depended on. And when that structure disappears, they are forced to experience something they have been avoiding for a long time, the consequences of emotional distance, without someone chasing behind them. That is the moment awareness begins to enter the equation, not through pain, not through conflict, but through absence that cannot be ignored. And in that absence, the avoidant is no longer dealing with your emotions. They are finally dealing with their own. And once that happens, the dynamic is never the same again. One of the most quietly destructive illusions in relationships with avoidance is the belief that consistency from you guarantees emotional reciprocity from them. It feels logical at first. If you show up, stay patient, remain loyal, and keep choosing the connection, surely the other person will eventually meet you there. But what actually happens is far more complex because over time, consistency can be misread when it is not paired with boundaries. You start to become familiar. And familiarity, when it is not respected, slowly gets interpreted as permanence. This is where the deeper psychological distortion begins. The avoidant doesn't always consciously think they will never leave. Instead, it becomes an unconscious assumption built through repeated experience. Every time they withdraw and you return, every time they go silent and you re-engage, every time they pull away and you restore connection, a pattern is reinforced. Access is available regardless of behavior. And when access feels guaranteed, value often becomes invisible. Not because the avoidant is intentionally devaluing you, but because the nervous system adapts to what it believes will always remain. Humans don't emotionally register what feels constant in the same way they register what feels uncertain. And that's where your loyalty, your patience, and your emotional endurance slowly stop being experienced as extraordinary effort and start being filed away as normal. This is one of the most painful misunderstandings in attachment dynamics. You are giving from depth. They are receiving from expectation. So over time, your emotional presence becomes something they rely on without fully acknowledging its cost. They begin to assume that even if they withdraw, even if they avoid accountability, even if they remain inconsistent, the emoji, three on a L connection will still be there waiting when they return. That assumption creates a quiet imbalance. Because while you are investing emotionally with intention, they are engaging with the relationship through a lens of availability rather than appreciation. And when availability becomes predictable, the emotional urgency to protect or value it weakens. But here is where the shift becomes irreversible. The moment you genuinely stop operating from that pattern, everything they assumed about the dynamic begins to collapse. When you no longer respond immediately, when you no longer explain your feelings repeatedly, when you no longer restore connection after emotional withdrawal, when you no longer make yourself emotionally accessible on demand, something unfamiliar enters the space, distance without recovery. And that is where the realization hits. Because now, the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone who is emotionally available by default. They are interacting with someone who has reclaimed their attention, and that changes the psychological foundation of the entire connection. They begin to recognize, often for the first time, that your presence was not guaranteed. Three was chosen. And anything that can be chosen can also be withdrawn. That's the moment the illusion breaks. Because what once felt permanent is now revealed to be conditional on mutual effort. And when they finally experience your absence without immediate restoration, it forces a recalibration. Not just of how they see you, but of how they understand relational stability itself. They start to notice the silence differently. They start to feel the gap your consistency used to fill. They start to recognize the emotional labor they had unconsciously depended on. And most importantly, they begin to see the difference between having someone and assuming someone. This is where emotional entitlement begins to dissolve. Not through confrontation, but through consequence. Not through argument, but through absence. And once that illusion of permanence is gone, the dynamic can no longer function the same way. Because now every interaction carries weight again. Every absence means something again. Every choice becomes visible again. And in that clarity, one truth becomes unavoidable. What they thought would always be there was never guaranteed. It was being sustained by you all along and on. Because that realization lands, the relationship can never return to unconscious assumption again. What people rarely understand is that relationships don't just reveal who someone else is, they reveal who you are becoming inside of them. And when you are connected to an avoidant dynamic, your emotional evolution becomes one of the most powerful and often most uncomfortable transformations you can experience. Because as long as you were emotionally entangled in the push and pull, your attention was partially occupied with them, with their moods, their silence, their inconsistencies, their return, their absence. You were constantly trying to interpret behavior, stabilize uncertainty, and restore connection. And in that process, your emotional energy was being directed outward. But then something changes when you begin to heal. Not performatively, not as a strategy, but genuinely. You start to come back to yourself. At first, it looks subtle. You stop overthinking their silence as quickly. You stop immediately assigning meaning to their distance. You stop trying to resolve emotional uncertainty that was never yours to carry alone. And slowly your nervous system begins to recalibrate presence 3 away from constant activation. This is where something very interesting happens in the avoidant dynamic. Your healing doesn't just change you, it changes the emotional environment they are used to. Because avoidants are highly attuned to emotional predictability, even when they appear detached. They may not express emotions in traditional ways, but they are still operating within relational systems. They learn patterns, they recognize responses, they adapt to emotional structures. And for a long time, your emotional availability created a structure they could rely on without fully engaging with it. But when you begin to regulate yourself differently, that structure shifts. You are no longer reacting in the same way. You are no longer available in the same way. You are no longer emotionally organized around their behavior. And that creates something they don't easily process. Contrast. Now they are faced with a version of you that is no longer shaped by their inconsistency. And contrast is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human perception. We often don't recognize value until we experience its absence in comparison to what replaces it. So as you become more grounded, more self-contained, more emotionally independent, something begins to register in them even if they cannot fully articulate it. You are no longer orbiting them emotionally. And when that happens, the avoidant is no longer just interacting with a partner. They are interacting with a mirror they can't easily control anymore. Because your healing reflects something back to them that is difficult to avoid. The emotional cost of disconnection. When you were still chasing, they could remain in a familiar rhythm. Distance, return, reconnection, withdrawal again. It created a cycle that felt manageable because it never fully required internal accountability. But when your energy stabilizes, that cycle loses its rhythm. There is no longer the same emotional rebound waiting for them. And this is where internal conflict begins to surface, not necessarily in words, not necessarily in direct communication, but internally. They begin to notice your absence differently. They begin to sense your independence as something unfamiliar. They begin to feel the loss of emotional access they once took for granted. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to confront something they avoided while you were. I'm still chasing. The impact of their behavior without immediate repair. Because when you were constantly trying to fix things, you were also unconsciously buffering them from consequence. Your presence softened the emotional reality of distance. Your engagement made disconnection feel temporary. Your effort filled the space that their avoidance created. But healing removes that buffer. And when the buffer is gone, reality becomes clearer. This is why your growth can feel so unsettling to someone who is not used to emotional accountability. It is not that you have become distant in a cold or punitive way. It is that you have become internally aligned in a way that no longer compensates for emotional imbalance. And that alignment is powerful because it signals something irreversible. You are no longer abandoning yourself to maintain access to someone else. At that point, the dynamic changes on a deeper level, not because you are trying to change them, but because you are no longer willing to distort yourself to maintain what was never stable to begin with. And in that realization, something becomes clear without needing to be said. When you healed, you didn't just recover your P. You removed the emotional structure that allowed imbalance to feel normal. This is where most people get confused because they think return equals love. They assume that if someone who is distant comes back, it must mean the connection was real or that regret has finally awakened something deeper. But with avoidant dynamics, return is not always about love in its highest form. Often it is about emotional processing that arrives late after distance has already created perspective. Avoidants don't always process emotions in real time. They often process through absence, through silence, through separation. Not because they don't feel, but because closeness can feel overwhelming to their internal system. So instead of moving toward emotional resolution in the moment, they often move away from it. They disconnect, they compartmentalize, they rationalize. And only later, when the emotional intensity has faded and distance has created safety, does clarity begin to surface. And that delay changes everything. Because by the time they start to understand what was actually lost, you are no longer the same emotional position you once were. So when they return, what do they really are? Threya returning to? They are often returning to a memory of emotional safety. A version of you that was available, responsive, understanding, and willing to bridge the gap no matter how inconsistent things became. In their mind, they are not always consciously trying to restart the cycle. Sometimes they are trying to reconnect with a feeling that only your presence once gave them stability without pressure, closeness without overwhelming demand. But here's the key truth. You are no longer that version of you. And that is where the psychological tension begins. Because your growth, your detachment, your emotional independence has already changed the relational equation. You are no longer operating from the same place of emotional availability that made the cycle sustainable before. And yet, in their internal map, they often still expect access to that version of you. So when they reappear, it creates a mismatch. They are approaching based on old emotional data. You are responding from a new emotional reality. And that gap is where confusion, friction, and misalignment begin to surface. This is why avoidant returns often feel inconsistent. They may reach out, then withdraw again. They may then disappear. They may oscillate between warmth and distance, not necessarily because they are trying to manipulate, but because their internal system is still trying to reconcile something that was never fully processed in real time. Distance gave them perspective, yes, but it also gave them detachment from emotional urgency. And without urgency, clarity often arrives in fragments, not in full integration. So they return with partial awareness. They feel something, they recognize something, but they have not fully integrated what it means to show up differently. And meanwhile, you are no longer in the same emotional state that once absorbed that inconsistency. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They interpret the return as a reset, as if everything goes back to where it was before. But emotionally, nothing goes back. Because once awareness has entered the system, once you have seen the pattern, felt the cost, and reclaimed your emotional center, you cannot unknow it. So the return is not a restart. It is a test of alignment. Not a test you impose on them, but a reality that naturally reveals whether there is true change or just emotional revival. Sighting. And often what becomes clear is this: the return is not the resolution. It is the reflection. It reflects what was left unresolved in them and what is no longer available in you. Because you are no longer responding from longing. You are no longer responding from emotional scarcity. You are no longer responding from fear of loss. You are responding from awareness. And awareness changes the entire meaning of reconnection. At that point, even their presence cannot recreate the old dynamic unless both people have changed at a structural level. Otherwise, the cycle repeats, just with new language and slightly different timing. And this is the deeper truth behind their return. It doesn't always mean the relationship is meant to continue. Sometimes it simply means the emotional echo has finally reached awareness, but awareness alone is not transformation. And once you see that clearly, you stop confusing return with resolution, because not every comeback is a sign of love becoming stronger. Sometimes it is just the mind trying to understand what it lost after it was already gone. At the deepest level, this entire dynamic was never really about them. It was never about decoding their silence, their distance, or their emotional inconsistency, as if the answer to your piece was hidden inside their behavior. That's the trap most people fall into. They believe if they can just understand the avoidant enough, love them correctly enough, or wait long enough, something will finally click and the story will resolve itself. But that's not how emotional freedom works, because the real turning point was never their awakening. It was yours. There comes a moment in these dynamics where something quietly shifts inside you. At first, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like exhaustion. Then it feels like clarity. And eventually it becomes something much deeper: self-respect that no longer negotiates with inconsistency. You stop asking, why aren't they showing up for me? And you start asking a much more powerful question. Why am I still showing up for something that requires me to abandon myself? That question changes everything, because now the focus is no longer on fixing someone else's emotional limitations. It is on recognizing the cost of participating in a dynamic that only functions when you overextend yourself emotionally. And this is where the final illusion breaks. The illusion that love requires self-erasure. You begin to see that your patience was not the problem. Your empathy was not the weakness. Your depth was not the issue. The real issue was the absence of reciprocity, masked by moments of connection that kept you emotionally invested just enough to stay in the cycle. And once you see that pattern clearly, something irreversible happens internally. You stop negotiating with confusion. You stop interpreting inconsistency as potential. You stop mistaking emotional intensity for emotional availability. And slowly, your nervous system begins to shift out of survival mode and into truth mode. This is what emotional freedom actually looks like. Not bitterness, not revenge, not proving a point, but clarity without emotional addiction to outcome. Because when you are no longer emotionally dependent on their response, you regain something far more valuable than their attention. You regain your center. And from that center, everything looks different. You begin to realize that the moments you call love were often moments of emotional activation, not stability. You start to see that the highs and lows were not passion, but dysregulation. And you understand that real connection does not require you to constantly question your worth, your place, or your reality. That realization is not easy, but it is freeing, because it brings you back to yourself. And this is where the true victory lies, not in finally being chosen by someone who is inconsistent, but in no longer needing to be chosen by someone who required you to shrink in order to stay. At that point, the dynamic loses its grip, not because they change, but because you do. You are no longer operating from emotional hunger. You are no longer operating from fear of abandonment. You are no longer operating from hope that suffering will eventually transform into security. You are operating from awareness. And awareness ends cycles that attachment alone cannot fix. Because once you see the pattern without illusion, you stop participating in it unconsciously. You stop feeding it with your attention, your patience, your emotional labor, and your repeated returns to imbalance. And what remains is something simple but powerful. You choosing yourself without negotiation. That is the real end of the story. Not when they finally understand what they lost. Not when they finally return differently. Not when they finally change. But when you no longer build your emotional life around people who require your self-abandonment in order to stay connected, and in that moment you realize something profound. The game didn't end because you won it. It ended because you stopped playing it at the expense of yourself. And when you step back and see the full picture of everything we've talked about, something becomes very clear. This was never just a story about avoidance. It was never just about who withdrew, who returned, who stayed distant, or who finally started to feel your absence. It was always about a shift in consciousness. Because at the beginning, you were participating in a dynamic where love was mixed with uncertainty, where consistency was one-sided, where emotional effort was something you constantly provided just to keep the connection alive. And in that space, it can feel like the other person holds all the power because they are the one who withdraws. They are the one who decides when connection happens, and they are the one whose silence creates anxiety. But over time, something changes. Not in them first, but in you. You start to see the array of patterns instead of possibilities. You start to feel exhaustion instead of confusion. You start to recognize that peace cannot coexist with constant emotional uncertainty. And that is the beginning of your awakening. Because the moment you stop chasing clarity from someone who benefits from confusion, you begin to reclaim your own emotional authority. The moment you stop overgiving to someone who only meets you halfway, you begin to restore balance. And the moment you stop interpreting inconsistency as something you need to fix, you finally step out of the cycle. And here is the truth that ties everything together. Avoidance didn't destroy your peace. Your participation in self-abandonment did. But the beautiful part is this. Once you see that clearly, you are no longer trapped in it. Because awareness breaks repetition. So whether they came closer or stayed distant, whether they returned or remained silent, whether they finally understood your value or never did, none of that is the real victory. The real victory is that you stop making your emotional stability dependent on someone else's capacity to show up. You stopped chasing. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped proof and your worth to people who could only recognize it in your absence. And in doing so, you didn't just change the relationship, you changed yourself. You moved from emotional dependency into emotional sovereignty, from reaction into awareness, from chasing love into embodying self-respect. And once you reach that place, you realize something powerful. You were never meant to lose yourself in order to be chosen. You were meant to choose yourself first and let everything real align after that. Because the highest form of love was never about being pursued or finally understood by someone unavailable. It was about reaching a point where you no longer abandon yourself to be loved at all. And that is where the cycle ends. Not with their realization, not with their return, but with your decision to finally stop living inside patterns that require you to forget your own value. And from that moment forward, nothing about your life can remain the same because you are no longer available for anything that asks you to disappear in order to belong.